I say this without hesitation and without regret. X-Men the Animated Series is probably the greatest on-screen representation the brand has ever seen, and more than likely will ever see. The movies have their moments for sure, but they initially tried to cloak their source material. In trying to legitimize and justify this superhero series, they at times delegitimized it, and did the comic canon a massive injustice. But X-Men the Animated Series was so unashamedly a superhero show. It carries over everything that made those comics work, and a few of the elements that worked against them. But I think I love it that much more for that. It might just be the most accurate adaptation of comic characters in a television series. The characters look the part, seem the part, and speak the part. The show follows in the footsteps of the comics in terms of tone, and while sure, sometimes it would water itself down a little bit to be more accessible to a general audience, it still managed to stay within the spirit of the books, often recreating the brand's most iconic stories. Stories that are surprisingly retold a lot on this show. More often than not, it seems the major moments that play out here, I've read somewhere else. Because of this, it feels less like a translation of the comics, and more like a transition of those comics onto the small screen. When they're not recreating stories verbatim, they're using already established plot points to flesh out a wider narrative. I also appreciate that while each episode seems to work on its own, it also works in favor of the season. These smaller stories add to one bigger story. A lot of the episodes are self-contained, and when they're not, they're made into two-parters, but there's still always a sense of continuity here. There's an episode plot, and then there's a season plot that the episode plays into. Because of this, the show always plays out very fluidly, and I was pleasantly surprised when rewatching this just how well each event ties into the next, which wasn't commonplace at the time. A lot of shows typically approach their material with a much different mentality, usually throwing everything that they could at the wall, seeing what stuck, and whatever did might get reused. This feels considerably more well thought out. As a fan of the comics, I thoroughly enjoyed the fan service this series provides, basically rolling out the red carpet and having all their mutant stars walk down it. You never know who's going to show up from one episode to the next. Their appearance may be something minor, or it could mean something major. I've always appreciated that any time this show has had to use multiple mutants in the background of a shot, instead of just creating mutant NPCs, they take major characters from the comics and have them serve as extras in other mutant stories. Now that's a kind of fan service I can get behind. The fact that a chunk of these characters would return to the show later on in more prominent roles also helps this world feel that much more connected. The first season sees Colossus meet the team, Cable show up for an at first unexplained cameo, and Juggernaut making one of only 2 appearances on the show that he'd make. Like I said, you never know who's gonna show up and what it is they'll be doing, even if it's nothing at all. While most shows improve over time, this one was great from the get-go. This season starts off strong and finishes even stronger, each episode being better than the last, with next to no duds. This series saw some of its most beloved episodes in the first season of the show. Being as this was a cartoon for a younger audience, it does try to keep things lighter than the comics did at times. But just because this is a kid's cartoon doesn't mean they're handling the source material with kid gloves. The show knew when to take itself seriously, and that was most of the time. From the very start, this show was tackling harsh issues that mutant kind would have to face. Even in the show's infancy, it was tackling the harsh issues that accompanied mutant kind. I would actually argue that they portrayed the anti-mutant rhetoric a lot better than the big screen adaptations did. People live in a deep fear, a confused state, and otherwise hatred for humanity. The people's prejudice of mutants goes far beyond the court of public opinion. Not only are they not thought of fondly by their peers, but there are anti-mutant acts and legislation at the time. They're treated like criminals due to being different. Mutants are hunted down simply for the crime of existing by Titan-sized robots called Sentinels. Their one mission being to eradicate mutant kind, or at the very least, keep them prisoner. These aren't your typical good guy, bad guy stories. These are complex stories about how something as simple as one's existence could be made into a political talking point. There's so much to love about this show. Everything about it was so instantly iconic. From the unforgettable theme song and accompanying opening animation, to character design so spot on that you could swear that you're flipping through the pages these characters were first printed on. Down to the way the show showcases the character's skills and mutant abilities. This got so much of those original comics right. The visuals could be absolutely stunning at times, especially when they revolve around Professor X's powers, which always provides some interesting takes on heroes and villains' psyches. There is so much that makes this show so good. Let us not forget that this is also a show that shares the same continuity with another beloved animated superhero series, though that would come later. Now, is this show perfect? Yes. Wait, no, I'm sorry, I was supposed to say no.
Boss, why are you posting that?
Are you an X-Man fan? Well, me too. Which is why I think you might like what I have to say next. WhatNotCon. What is WhatNotCon? Why, it's only the world's largest virtual comic convention that brings the joy of comic conventions right at home into your living room. Get to see everyone you want to see, and never stand in a never-ending line again. From April 11th to April 14th, come see the subject of today's video, the original cast of X-Men the Animated Series. Meet Spawn and Venom creator and awesome toy designer Todd McFarlane, and come give Deadpool creator Rob Liefeld a hand, because he doesn't know what to do with a foot. And the best part of all of this is that you get to do all of this and more, and you get the best seat in the house. Your own. Get your hands on exclusive content with deals you literally won't get anywhere else, as over 20 comics and toys will be releasing during the event, including the first issues of X-Men 97, which is both topical and just awesome all on its own. This event will host over 1,400 exhibitors. We're talking artists, celebrities, major studios, and sellers. All of that, and you never have to stand in a line. Whatnot ensures special guests and surprises, and I can assure you, a good time. If this interests you, and I can't imagine who it wouldn't, click that link in the description below for $10 free to spend on whatever you want on the Whatnot app. And as always, remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out. Is this show perfect? Yes. Damn it. No, there are some issues. The animation can be a little janky at times. Sometimes the characters' outlines will change between frames, their movements can be a little repetitive, and the series definitely takes its shortcuts, and man did it love its own theme song. But hey, so did we. But all of these blemishes pale in comparison to the rest of the product. The action, the storytelling, the characters, even with its flaws, or maybe in part because of them, I can't help but love this show. It's real easy for me to see why this is so many fans' favorite iteration of the team. Speaking of team, this series does a great job of showcasing them each individually, with the focal point changing from episode to episode. Because of this, it doesn't seem like the show has a real main character. The team itself is the main character, with select episodes monitoring and developing a different one of its leads as time goes on. Going into more depth about these characters, I find it really hard to talk about these particular portrayals, because typically when something is translated from one media to the next, changes are made, and from those changes come talking points. What they got right, what they got wrong, what they did different. But in this case, I feel like I could take any depiction or design of a character and just say, it's perfect, it's just like how it is in the comics. And that's it, and that would suffice. Something that always bugged me about the show, though, is the intro shows the character Thunderbird, but he doesn't make more than a minor cameo in the actual show itself. Furthermore, it looks like he's aligned with the villains, while the character is outright heroic. He's not even in an area shaded gray, he's as good as they get. The reason for this is because the character was originally intended to make a major appearance on the actual show. Initially, he was going to be the series' first casualty, put in place to showcase the threats that the team comes across. Which makes sense as Thunderbird met a similar fate early on in the comics, but being as he was the show's only Native American character, many behind the scenes felt that that would be in poor taste. So he only appears in the opening because they needed another character model in that spot, and his was already created. Which is the same reason this little pink dude appears beside him, as again, he's only had a very brief appearance in the show that saw him do nothing of note. The role that was initially planned for Thunderbird would have to go to someone else, and created to be the proverbial sacrificial lamb came the character of Morph, an adaptation of Changeling, a mutant with similar abilities to Mystique. Now, Morph doesn't last long on our screens in the first season, but he did leave a lasting impression. The character acted as the team's comic foil. He's played for laughs, but I don't think they ever really come. And that's not to say that he's outright unlikable, as the character does get some fanfare in future episodes, and fans of the show do have some fond memories of the good guy who was lost in action. He certainly served his purpose to the plot. His passing informed audiences on the stakes at hand, put characters at odds with each other, forcing them to develop as a force, and added to a season-long narrative. That's pretty good for a guy who was never even supposed to be there. Similar to Morph, Beast is sidelined for most of the season, though it isn't from apparent death, but instead detainment. He's captured in the same incident that Morph is killed in, and taken in by the government for questioning. When presented with an opportunity for escape, Beast declines, choosing to instead stay within the system and prove his innocence in trial. The behind-the-scenes reason for his part-time screen time is because producers didn't think Beast was a strong enough character to help lead the show in its infancy, which really has to be seen as one of the rare L's the X-Men have ever taken. Beast is one of the most interesting characters put to comic book panels. He has the body of a brainless monster and the brain of a well-educated man. The man's nature and nurture seem to be a total contrast from each other. He was brought up in a society that treated him like a savage, and yet at his core he's dignified and civilized. How could you not see the creative narrative potential for a three-dimensional character like that? Despite this, I think that this storyline, even if it was only meant to sideline the character, does more to explain and explore it. We learn so much about Beast's beliefs and values. He has hope in humanity in spite of the treatment that he's received from it. He has a desire to be a part of that society in spite of being ostracized by it. While this move was solely meant to take Beast out of action, I can't help but feel this angle did more to inform viewers on his character, as well as play heavily into the show's themes of prejudice. Of course, the fight scenes in the shows of power were what drew me in as a kid, but watching this back as an adult, this is probably the most compelling story arc of the entire first season. In terms of the team, this is probably the greatest X-Men lineup in the history of the team. Not only in terms of a quality-quantity lineup, but in terms of dead-on depictions that don't reinterpret the characters, they just realize them. Jubilee sort of serves as an introduction to not only the X-Men, but to the lore itself. The story follows her introduction and induction into the team. As she knows very little about her surroundings, the plot basically explains itself to her and the viewer in the process. In addition to serving as our window into this world, being as she's the youngest and least experienced on the team, she's typically more of a hindrance than she is a help. I mean, it's not entirely her fault, she's still learning, but because of this, in a lot of the early episodes, she can come off more like a damsel in distress than anything else. Wolverine is every bit as gruff as his voice is. He's a stoic loner who doesn't have much to say. And when he does speak, his words are hardly ever words of encouragement. He's a short grump with a chip on his shoulder. He's unlikable, and that's not a flaw of the character, that's the primary function of this character. Still, we learn that some of that is persona, and that deep down there's a person underneath that rough exterior, though how much of one is really anybody's guess. I think when people think of Wolverine, a lot of people think of Hugh Jackman, which is valid. The guy's been in the same role for almost 2.5 decades, and while he is phenomenal in that part, the cartoon and Cal Dodd captured the character from the comics in a way that I don't think has ever been replicated. While Hugh Jackman might have made the character his own, Cal Dodd presented the perfect Wolverine as is. Equally great is this show's Scott Summers. This has to by far be the best Cyclops that has ever been brought to the screen, big or small. Unlike every other incarnation of the character that came out after, and even the very few that came before, this Cyclops is a born leader. He acts as the team's decision maker and just overall planner. It's crazy how often this trait is dropped with the character, when it is the defining trait of this character. The animated series shows Cyclops as being smart, strategic, strong, but most importantly, noble. Cyclops is the X-Men's respected leader, willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for his team, but not willing to sacrifice his team. He prioritizes playing protector over everything else in his life, even his own love life, which can on occasion get in the way of things with Jean Grey. Jean Grey, who is also the object of Wolverine's affection. This leads to tension between the two team members, as Wolverine resents that Jean Grey wouldn't give him a shot because she's already spoken for, and believes that Scott isn't good enough for her. Though this isn't the only reason for hostility between these two heroes. As previously stated, Cyclops is the one giving orders. And make no mistake, Wolverine is not one who just goes about taking orders. He's a part of the team, but it feels like it's a part-time gig. There's some sense of unity between the rest of the X-Men. While they do feel like a true team, Wolverine isn't exactly a team player, and can come off more like an unwilling associate. So these two were always destined to clash in some form or fashion, for one reason or another. It was an inevitability with their personalities. Speaking of Jean, while she's a relatively big plot point in the first season of the show, she's not much of a character in the first season of the show. Easily the most underdeveloped out of everybody. Her powers aren't really ever fully explained. Out of everyone, she definitely makes the least amount of an impression in the first season. She just sort of lost at sea in a sea of other names. The emphasis isn't put on her place in the team, but rather her place in the leads' lives. Rogue is the Southern Belle with a big personality, gifted with the power to absorb others' powers, personalities, and past memories, though it's not all it's cracked up to be. Her unique abilities lead to an inability of connecting to another, as she can't make any sort of skin-to-skin contact without harming those she touches. This makes her feel alienated in a world she's already been treated like an alien in. Despite her high energy, behind her sarcastic barbs is a real sadness, one that weighs on her heavily, and at one point even tempts her to cure her mutations. Eventually she decides against it, realizing while her powers have hurt her, they have the potential to help others. Nonetheless, here to try to sweep her off her feet anyway is the smooth-talking mutant with a pleasant accent, Gambit. He essentially acts as the Pepe Le Pew to Rogue's Penelope, just without the need to cancel this cartoon. A wisecracking romantic who doesn't give up even when he's behind. But granted, his flirtations always come across as playful rather than creepy. And it's not all unwarranted, as the team have openly theorized that Rogue has a bit of a soft spot for the charming Cajun. Rogue constantly rejects Gambit, not because she's uninterested, but because she's unable. She doesn't want to hurt him. She's not fighting off his advances, she's fighting off her affection. Gambit was always my favorite growing up. He has the best bits in the entire series. Always cracking jokes or making witty observation, and he had the coolest looking power. I mean, I definitely didn't get what that was as a kid. To me, he was just throwing glowing playing cards at people, and I loved it. But in actuality, he's manipulating kinetic energy, which means what I just said, but now it sounds cooler. Storm is probably the coolest out of the bunch, and that's not some sort of pun. Her powers lead to the most interesting visuals aside from Professor X. Her fight scenes always look the best, and her character has the best looking attire out of the whole team. She also feels the most balanced. She's strong but vulnerable, smart but capable of error, powerful but not indestructible. And in spite of all of her strength, she isn't without weakness. She can create storms at will, shoot lightning out of her fingertips, take to the skies with the wind beneath her sails. But she's in incredible fear of small dark places, suffering from claustrophobia brought on by her own traumatic experiences, having been trapped under rubble as her parents were taken from her. I feel like these traits showcase that in spite of their omnipotent power, mutants are still just human beings at the end of the day. Human beings with their own hang-ups, their own trauma, their own problems. Power isn't always the solution. The team was put together by Professor X, who honestly isn't as hands-on in this as he typically is in other media, but again, that's not a complaint. I think that the distance between he and the viewer adds to his mystique. Not a pun. And his absence allows the team to strategize on their own and have them bond or brawl when left to their own devices. He's a docile teacher, a beacon of wisdom and support, and a calm, level-headed presence that can de-escalate a situation through verbal interjection or telepathy, whichever the situation calls for. Charles's good nature is always on full display, as he invites anyone and everyone into his home, including those that oppose him, his enemies and his friends that turned enemies. Previously, the professor used to work alongside a man named Magnus. Their need to repair damaged lives and better the world brought them together, but their feelings toward how to achieve that goal drove them apart. Magnus, better known to fans as Magneto, is a mutant with godlike power and a great impatience. He and his family have been the victims of prejudice before. While the war and events aren't referenced by name here, he too shares the same story as his comic book counterpart, seeing mankind's greatest atrocities firsthand. And after witnessing humanity at its cruelest, he becomes obsessed with protecting mutant kind from experiencing the same type of treatment he and his people received. The Professor and Magneto's relationship is hostile, but there's still a shared respect and even still a lingering friendship between the two. They admire each other, but they don't agree with each other. The two aren't opposed to working side by side as we see in the finale, but they also aren't opposed to opposing each other either. Working underneath Magneto as his heavy is Sabretooth. And like Magneto and Xavier, Sabretooth and Wolverine share a very similar past. These friends turned foes are an allegiance to those other friends turned foes. A past history between the two is always referenced, but never shown or explained in explicit detail. What we can gather from the pieces of information that are said in passing, the two teamed together, had been buds, until Sabretooth went rogue, again, not a pun, and killed some of Wolverine's friends. Yet it's actually Sabretooth that's out for revenge for some reason. It's not Logan going out of his way to seek him out. It's always Sabretooth that's on his trail following his scent. Unlike Magneto and the Professor, there is no love loss here. These two do not like each other. They loathe each other's very existence. Wolverine would be much happier if someone took Sabretooth out of his misery. Not a lot happier, mind you, but maybe a little bit less miserable. The Wolverine rivalry really drives the character, and anytime those two share a screen, it's worth the watch. That's also far from the only complicated relationship between heroes and villains the first season provides, as in the season's final episodes, Mystique reveals herself to be Rogue's mother figure. Mystique tries to reach out to Rogue, at first trying to convert her into becoming a horseman of Apocalypse. Apocalypse being the big bad of whom she served as the right hand of. A mutant known as Archangel aids in developing a cure for the mutant gene. Desperate to live life with some semblance of normality, his shame leads him to being tricked into a scheme by Mystique, forcing him into the machine of his creation. The machine does in fact give mutants a new lease on life, although instead of making them ordinary human beings, it turns them into Apocalypse's slaves. He leads his lackeys, these mind-washed mutants, as the Four Horsemen, in an effort to destroy humans and mutants alike. But Apocalypse doesn't see the end of everything, as he's seemingly stopped in 2 episodes' time by the X-Men. Mystique tries to see her plan through nonetheless by taking out an anti-mutant senator, Robert Kelly, who we'll get into in a minute. But she too is stopped by the X-Men, with Rogue hiding her away after learning of her true identity. This is a really compelling plot that feels rushed at the end of a season. I don't think we get the weight of this moment because it's happening when there's already so much going on. Despite all of the threats the X-Men face, the biggest hazard had to be the humans, or more accurately, what they created. In trying to protect themselves against mutanity, they have only doomed humanity. In addition to the Sentinels that were wreaking havoc, causing millions in property damage alone, Bolivar Trask and Henry Peter Gyrich create Master Mold. But as per usual, this Sentinel-making machine gains sentience, and through misunderstanding, or perhaps in hindsight, complete understanding, goes after all of humanity, as the supercomputer can no longer make a distinction between humans and mutants, seeing the two as one and the same.
You were designed to protect humans from mutants.
Mutants are human. Humans must be protected from themselves.
Which is kinda poetic when you think about it. In the end, the same people who are creating weapons to be used against mutants have to ask mutants for help against those weapons. Senator Kelly runs for office with campaigns surrounding his anti-mutant rhetoric. And what I truly love about this show is how it's depicted. As mutants are already an allegory for civil rights and gay rights, and really just a tongue-in-cheek representation of minority groups in general, a disliking for mutants is already just disguised racism, homophobia, and whatever else. It would be so easy to have this character bask in prejudice just for the sake of hatred. He could have very well been written to be an evil man who just doesn't like them because they're different. But the show takes a different approach. It shows that his feelings towards mutants were brought on not by hatred, not by malice, but by concern and misunderstanding. After being saved by mutants on multiple occasions, he rethinks his stance and begins campaigning with mutant rights in mind. It's interesting seeing this kind of Saul to Paul change made here, showing that even the biggest retractors were still capable of change. This isn't the end of mutant-human conflict, but it is, at the very least, the end of a small chapter of it. So in a nutshell, that's Season 1 of X-Men the Animated Series. And if you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed that season, and you'd be interested in seeing me take a look at the next season of the show, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"Did I see X-Men?"
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.